I mean, how many times have you given an email address, created a password, told someone your first name, last name, maybe your address, maybe your mother's maiden name, maybe your first pet's name?
Bitcoin, crypto,
Ethereum, crypto assets,
NFT.
Welcome to Not Another Crypto Show.
Welcome back to Not Another Crypto Show. Of course, we had a bumper edition last week. We had the incredible Kelly Ann Collins, one of the first influencers in Web2, starting way back when you had to ask someone for the opportunity to get a Gmail address. And following in that segue of great people in great spaces at the right time, we've got a wonderful guest today. Now, I am the butcherer of names. So although I can say my own name, this is Allan Scott. This is Not Another Crypto Show. And if you like this show and if you think it's worthy, please give us 5 stars at the end of it, so I'm not having to do this at the end of the show, and subscribe and leave a comment of anything that you learned from this show. Anything, whether it's about this incredible book, which we'll talk about in the show, whether it's about the ETH merge, which you will learn about in the middle of the show, whether it's about enterprise solutions, which you will learn about in the show. Add anything in the comments. It makes a big deal for us. It allows our team to know that they're doing the right stuff in the right time for the right people. So without further ado, and making you wait another second, Conor. Conor, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, Jason. Great to be here today. So my name's Conor Svensson. I'm the founder and CEO of Web3 Labs. Web3 Labs, as the name may indicate, is a company focused on Web3. What we do specifically, we work with corporates on their Web3 strategy and also support them in their implementation and delivery of systems. And we have a number of different software products as well that back this up, which includes an open source Ethereum integration library, which I wrote a number of years ago, and also a Web3 data and analytics platform called Epirus, soon to be rebranded to Serato.
Love that. There's a lot to unpack there. The first question that we always get from our audience is, why you and why now?
So why now? Potentially, it's because of where Web3 is. I've been immersed full-time in the space since 2016. I came from a technology background, specifically in the finance domain. And back in 2016, I remember reading this article that I'd heard a bit of stuff around blockchain. So I was working on a startup that didn't work out at that time with some other people. And there's a lot of noise about blockchain going back to 2015 in the financial markets and how it could be useful there. And I was like, yeah, this hype thing there. And then one day I read this article and it said this Ethereum, you can mine this cryptocurrency using commodity graphics cards. And I thought, okay, did a bit of research. Ethereum's like this, what was really a leading blockchain platform. And I thought this could be a fun project. And so what I did, I went on Gumtree, bought a load of GPUs. I was living in Sydney at the time, and then decided to assemble this mining rig, which involved going to hardware stores, buying some metal strips and wood, and in effect sort of manufacturing this open-ended case to put a computer into. The reason it had to be this kind of bespoke case is that these graphics cards generate a lot of heat. You can't just put them into a normal computer. And it was just a fun project. And so I turned it on, and then I had this thing that was sucking 1,000 watts of electricity 24/7, making a lot of noise, heating up this room in the house where it was. And given this was in Australia as well, it did get quite warm. And then, it kind of went from there. And, whilst this was kind of a fun little experiment back then, I started digging deeper into it. So I went along to the Sydney Ethereum community, presented about this mining rig, and got chatting to people, but also as a technologist started digging a bit deeper. And what I found was that the technology platform, which I'd spent the first 10 or so years of my career building platforms for large financial institutions, you couldn't really work with Ethereum with it. So I wrote an open source library called Web3J, which is basically an integration library. So if you have an Android phone, or if you work with the JVM, which a lot of corporates and enterprises do, and you want to use Ethereum, then this is the library that you use. And so it kind of...
What was the name of the library? Sorry, just to get that
It's
name.
called Web3J. So it was a reference to Web3, and then the J stood for Java. But it's just there's other background stuff specific with that, but I won't go into that today.
Please continue. I didn't interrupt. I thought that was interesting.
And so so this library got momentum, and it started to open a lot of doors in the community. Met lots of people as well, because back in 2016. Blockchain and Web3 wasn't like it is now. You kind of had a handful of Twitter accounts, and then you had the Reddit community, and that was really all you needed to keep up with what was happening in Ethereum. You didn't have this whole thing, or this was pre the ICO phase. You didn't have NFTs weren't a thing, DAOs weren't a thing, DeFi wasn't a thing. And so it was kind of like Ethereum was like this experimental compute platform. And then you had Bitcoin, and there were other projects out there, but that was kind of the dominance. And then in 2017, I decided to create a company to continue to develop on the open source, but also start working with organizations on Web3 technology, except back then we positioned it as blockchain technology, because whilst Web3 was a thing in the eyes of technologists, it hadn't really got that mainstream penetration to when you said Web3, you just get a blank look from someone. And
I still get those blank looks.
Yes, exactly. They're just not quite as many as you did back then.
Yes, that is true. That is very true. So you realized even back then in 2016 in your singlet in Australia while getting a tan, and I'm very jealous, I have to tell you. I lived in King's Cross for a month, and I absolutely loved it. Although I told everyone how friendly everyone was, and then I got told that I lived in the red light district, which did explain then quite a bit. You realized that there was something coming, that there was something exciting, and that there was these opportunities. Now, that seems to be the commonality with everyone that comes on the show, whether it's the opportunities for ownership, whether it's the opportunities for community, whether it's the opportunities to find like-minded people. Do you think that's what's got so many people excited? And obviously with you, and I'd like to focus on this, you're more enterprise driven. A lot of the people that we have on the show are very community driven, and it's very much a B2C, where by the sounds of things, including, and I'd love to talk about that afterwards, your book, you're more talking from the business perspective, from enterprise perspective. Why should businesses care about what we're doing right now?
First of all, I guess the reason why it appealed to me was just as a pure technologist. And so back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I'd been very into another very geeky thing, but this was Unix and Linux. So these were, again, really enterprise platforms that large parts of the large amounts of business infrastructure would run on. Like your average person using a computer back then would not really have any exposure to them. They'd be using Windows, or back then, I guess even Macs were coming back up again, but they hadn't quite got to where they are again now. And so these Unix and Linux platforms, they're really great at these large computational workflows, or just running what's called server-side software. So where you don't have a UI, you just have something that's, working with data, doing some back-end computation. And what happened was, in the early days of the web, a lot of these websites used to be served on the Unix platform, but then it ultimately transitioned to an open source piece of software called Linux. And Linux was something that was more than just a piece of software. It was a movement in tech. It had a very transformative effect. You had the likes of Hewlett-Packard, IBM, and others who had these big proprietary operating systems, and Linux came along and just disrupted that. So instead of these companies having these nice chunky licensing fees for this proprietary software, they got displaced by an open source alternative. And I love that whole thing about the community and the open nature of it. And when I got interested in Ethereum, it was probably 15 years later, I saw something very similar there in terms of there was this passionate movement of technologists behind it. And so that was what really hooked me in, because it just appealed to the technologist in me. Like, I'd been aware of Bitcoin, I'd been around Bitcoin meetups and stuff before, but I'd never really got that into it because it was just a digital currency or store of value. And whilst that definitely appeals to some people, and I completely get it, as a technologist, I always loved this whole idea that Ethereum, and there are other platforms that have come since, but it was like this globally distributed computer. You write some code and then it executes on the internet, this internet scale computer, which is like mind blowing. And so that's what kind of got me really excited. And I guess the sort of enterprise angle that came from that was the world I knew, but it was also where I'd been interested, because I always loved this, like, what pulled me into that world was like these, just the complexity of it, these large scale systems, which are just a different beast to what you have in some other spaces. Now, that's not to say you don't have huge problems of scale in consumer facing applications. You absolutely do. If Facebook's has billions of active users per month, there's really significant infrastructure there. But I think the sort of the more normal thing in a lot of the business domain is it's quite technically complex work, and that kind of appealed to me. And because that's where I'd come from, that sort of lens was how it shaped my outlook on blockchain and Web3.
I love that. Now, recently you've written a book about blockchain, Web3. I'm going to allow you to punt your book. This is the opportunity to talk about. I'm an author. I know how hard it is to write a book. I say to everyone, if you can, don't write a book ever. It's so painful. And then I haven't had any kids, but I'm told it's like a kid. You create this beautiful thing that you think is amazing, and you send it out into the world to be judged. Yeah. So congratulations, firstly, on writing a book. Secondly, please tell us about it.
Yeah, thank you. So the book, I've got a copy of it here. It's called The Blockchain Innovator's Handbook. But really what it is it's me sharing my learnings about having worked in the space for the last, 6 years. What I wanted to do was just unpack all this knowledge that had been in my head and try and solidify it down on paper. I think to your point about the writing process, I found the actual writing it initially, like the first draft, easy. It was the after part which I hated, where it's like, right now it's all got to make sense. It's got to be coherent, and you just get sick of going through the manuscript again and again with all these edits and so on. But that was kind of the goal. Really was just to share knowledge, but also to provide people with a framework in terms of how they should be thinking about Web3. Part of that includes educating them, because it's still. It's a complex domain. It's very transformative. There's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of hype associated with it. Certainly, so many people have been drawn in via cryptocurrencies, and that's a purely speculative play. And what I wanted to do was just provide education so people can actually understand what these buzzwords mean, but also what I believe to be the broader significance of the technology and how people should be thinking about it and ways in which they can bring it in to ultimately bring value and solve problems that these organizations have.
I love that. Now, you're in the Ethereum inner circle. The Ethereum merge, you talked about hype a moment ago, is the hype right now. That's all we're hearing about. What happened, why it matters, why it's important. Could you illuminate us on this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, certainly I'd say I'm slightly removed from the inner circle, but I've been fortunate to meet and speak to a number of people who have really been living and breathing this stuff over the years. And, the likes of some of the teams who are actually working on the low-level protocols and the clients that actually facilitated the merge. And so the merge, broadly speaking, was really about transitioning Ethereum off what was called proof of work to something called proof of stake. The Bitcoin network uses a lot of electricity. I can't remember exactly which country it's on a par with, but it's very much on a par with some of the medium-sized countries of the world in terms of how much power it consumes. And Ethereum, certain aspects of it, whilst it was more than just a digital currency, it was a platform for computation. It used the same mechanism to reach consensus or agreement among participants of the network. So if we just talk about the foundations there, Jason, just quickly. So
please.
Just historically, and if I wanted to send some funds to you, it's always had to go through an intermediary, be that a bank or be via PayPal nowadays, or yes, I could hand you physical cash, but if we're trying to do this stuff digitally, there's always that intermediary in the mix there. And what Bitcoin managed to do was provide a mechanism for me to be able to send you funds in a digital currency directly via the Bitcoin network. So in effect, the network becomes the intermediary. So the way I think about it is that it's like these blockchain networks are a trust layer that sits on top of the internet, because you have the internet connectivity, which enables our computers to talk to one another, or us to have a conversation, right? That's the sort of backbone of it. But what blockchain and these digital currencies and provide is a kind of trust layer. So you actually use that network for the trust layer instead of an intermediary. And so specifically, in order to achieve that, what you have to have is lots of computers, because these computers power the network. Like the internet is made up of many, many computers providing services. For instance, if you type www.web3 labs into your browser, behind the scenes, that gets converted into what's called an IP address, which is a number, and then that gets routed to the relevant website. And so you have all of these decentralized services that run on the internet that provide this relatively frictionless experience that we experience day to day. And so with blockchain, it's kind of a similar thing. There's a network that's required to do that. And the approach that was taken by Bitcoin and subsequently Ethereum was to solve what's called a computationally hard problem, i.e., so in order to send, say we're in the early days of Bitcoin. I have one Bitcoin, right? And I wanted to send that to you. What that would do is it would go out to the network, and then all these different computers that make up the Bitcoin network would compete to put into what's called the block, and then submit that to the network. And then then if they were first to do it in a way that's in a certain way, then they would get a reward for that. And the way in which they did that was by solving a computationally hard problem, which requires a lot of electricity. So fundamentally, in order to send you a Bitcoin, lots of computers, like thousands of computers, have to compete and use a lot of electricity to try and win a race that's solving an algorithm. And so this, as the networks grew, started to use more and more power, and the Ethereum community were very aware of this and wanted to move away from this. And so what they did was they wanted to transition to something called proof of stake, which basically says, instead of us using lots of electricity in order to reach agreement with nodes on the network, well, what if all of the nodes making up the network, they instead put down like a wager to say, I'm an honest actor, and I'm going to contribute in a positive some way to the network. So I'm going to put some money on the table. If I do anything bad, you get to take some of that money away. If I do something good, I'll get a small return from that. And so that's what the transition was. And the big event from it, though, was ultimately it meant that the power consumption of the Ethereum network went down by roughly 99.95% in an instant. Apparently, in terms of when that happened, that would have reduced the electricity demands of the global energy grid by 0.2% as well, just to contextualize how significant an amount it was. And this event happened yesterday. That's Thursday, the 15th of December, shortly after 7:30 in the morning, British summertime. So it was a major event. It was considered one of the most significant events to happen in the Web3 and crypto worlds, really for the last few years. And it just worked, and there weren't any issues with it.
Now, the only issue that we did have is that the price dropped of Ethereum coins. Why is that? I would have thought that would have, I don't know, huddled the masses, that would have increased the value, but instead it had a reverse effect. Not a massive one, let's not get crazy. I think it was only 3% or 3 point something percent. But why is that? Is that because people got excited and sold?
So certainly if the markets were rational and we could understand why they do what they do, everyone would probably be a lot richer. But there has been a lot of appreciation in the price of Bitcoin versus Ethereum in the last 6 months. Ethereum now, its market capitalization is more than half of the Bitcoin networks, which is, I believe, the highest it's ever been. Wow. And so as a result of that, there's some argue that the merge was already priced in, but there were certainly a lot of people who were worried about it not succeeding. Now, when I'd been speaking to the technology teams who'd been on the ground with all of this, there was very much so a view of, let's just get it over with. We know we're happy now. We've spent so much time on this because these guys, and girls, they've been working on this stuff for years and doing lots of hardcore R&D. Some of the brightest minds out there as well in the technology fields as well. Like you working towards this, and with all of the tests they'd done, that it had all been very seamless. So it wasn't a surprise that it ran smoothly. And I know we can argue with hindsight and so on, of course, but they'd worked really hard. But the fact that they weren't going into it worried, of course, there was apprehension and nervousness just because it was such a transformative event of this network that's worth over $200 billion. But by the same token, they'd spent so long on it, and there weren't any signs along the way to suggest that it would be problematic. But tying it back to the value side of it, it's hard to understand why prices behave in the way they do. I think more fundamentally, and this is something I personally believe, is that the merge is a very significant event in terms of how it positions Ethereum for the long term, because in the last sort of year or two, we saw a lot of corporates getting into the world of, starting to take crypto on their balance sheets. What we saw was quite a common theme is that they'd buy a load of Bitcoin and Ether because those are the two largest cryptocurrencies. However, the whole narrative about the ESG narrative, that's a very big thing these days within corporates, is something that the Bitcoin network was getting a lot of flack for. Now, I'm not here to kind of, I guess, argue the points for and against that. There's certainly people who see the way in which the power consumption of the Bitcoin network, whilst it is high, it's also a way of using surplus electricity and being able to store it, so to speak, in this network. But it is quite a divisive topic. But with Ether, this whole ESG narrative just goes away overnight, and all of a sudden you have the second largest cryptocurrency by a significant margin, being something that's ESG friendly, whereas you've got Bitcoin that's still tainted by this whole ESG argument that in today's corporate world of ESG, by being quite a prominent topic within corporate governance and from the point of view of investors, I see there being a lot of appeal in them starting to transition away from Bitcoin to Ether. The other side of it, and this comes down to how this merge and this transition from proof of stake to proof of work works. With proof of work, where there were all these miners or nodes on the network were using lots of electricity, it was those miners that were using all this power would get the rewards from the network. So they'd get a yield by performing that activity. So you're converting power into Ether. Now, with this proof of stake model, because there's no significant power consumption requirements, instead what you have is anyone with Ether can put that Ether down and say, I'm going to use this to help secure the network, and they can get a yield for that of roughly 4%. So what that is, in effect, is a risk-free rate for cryptocurrency. So not only have you got this ESG narrative, which is incredibly positive in Ethereum's favor now, but you also have a 4% risk-free yield as long as you're okay with holding cryptocurrencies. And Ether is, and Bitcoin are the least volatile compared with the others. So when you talk about having a yield on top of it, it's very significant. Then on top of that, the third point as well is that depending on activity on the Ethereum network, it actually becomes a deflationary asset. Now, Bitcoin itself is inflationary to a point, and this is something that proponents of it have always spoken about, where they say, well, there's only going to be a certain amount of Bitcoin ever produced, and until we reach a certain size number of Bitcoin being created, the inflation rate is like 2% or slightly under that. Whereas Ethereum now, the way in which the network works, if there's enough activity on it, Ether actually gets destroyed. So not only do you have an asset that can generate this stable yield of 4%, it's also deflationary as long as there's enough activity on the network, and it's ESG friendly. And so for anyone with a rational mind looking at the potential upside of investing in a cryptocurrency, there's three factors there that are incredibly compelling. And because of that, I believe that this is the start of what will ultimately result in Ethereum overtaking Bitcoin as being the most popular cryptocurrency, because it's going to drive a lot of corporate interest. They might not be doing that the day after the merge, but I think over the coming months and years, it will happen.
It's beautiful that you ended that sentence with corporate interest, because obviously that's what Web3 Labs does. Can you give us a very short summary of what you do and how you serve the enterprise and corporates out there with Web3 Labs?
Yeah, sure. So whilst the price speculation and the mechanics of the market, there's an interesting part of it, because this has been really crypto and NFTs are the two things that have kind of come out of the Web3 ecosystem and become really mainstream. That's not what is the driving force for me. For me, it's always about the technology, and that's where we come into it with corporates. Yes, of course, if someone wants to pick my brains and talk about some of the broader macro perspectives on the market, I can give very, very limited insight into that. It's not, I'm a technologist at heart, but the bigger thing is that there's just a lot of opportunity for greater efficiency with these networks. So the way in which the world works right now with respect to technology is, say, for instance, if you use, if you go onto a regular website, chances are you go via Google for that. Google have got massive data silos of their own data that they own about the end users. And it's the same thing with Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Gmail, all these online services. But the point is that they ultimately have the same data about you. I mean, how many times have you given an email address, created a password, told someone your first name, last name, maybe your address, maybe your mother's maiden name, maybe your first pet's name, so on and so forth. And see, that data has been duplicated everywhere. And the reason for that is that you're putting your trust in that, in the entity there that you're dealing with. You're trusting Google, you're trusting Facebook, you're trusting whoever, or Amazon if you're buying things through their platform. And if you think about how you've got the same data duplicated in all these organizations, that's super inefficient. You might type something in incorrectly, or they might have some sort of data breach. There's so many ways in which it's problematic. But also you can think about that more broadly when if you've got a few different banks, for instance, dealing with a central bank. You have, say, the Bank of England, and they're obviously in charge of the monetary policy of the UK. And if they decide to put some more sterling in circulation, they'll speak to these other banks and say, hey, we're creating more sterling. Can you banks start lending it out to your customers? And that's how one of the ways anyway, in which they can get more sterling into the economy. And so if you think about when they deal with each of those banks own banks has got their own view of the world in terms of, this is these are the funds that have been made available. And hence, that same data is being duplicated in all these different organizations. And what happens with a blockchain network is that instead of duplicating this stuff, you create a network, and that network is the definitive source of truth. All of these different participants can plug into it, and it's just a huge efficiency gain. And that's why it's something that to me is so important for corporates, because ultimately it moves all of this data from these. Whilst it doesn't put all of the data onto blockchains, what it does is it puts key information there so that you have a single source of reference. So all these organizations don't need to keep talking to one another, or end users don't need to keep on sending the same information. So trying to keep it high level, that's kind of... That
was amazing. If people want to find out more, let's start with, where can they get the book and find out more?
So with the book, you can just head to Amazon, and just search for the Blockchain Innovators Handbook. Web3 Labs, our website, web3labs.com. And I'm very active on Twitter especially, but also LinkedIn.
And Twitter, what's your handle?
It's Conor Svensson.
Perfect.
So, yeah.
We're going to end there because we know we only give you exactly 27 minutes of highlights and hits, because apparently that's as long as you can take it. And then many of you disappear. We are going to have Conor back on, I think, with his permission, because I think he brings so much value, not only on a high side, but in the insight. And I think the macro and the micro is where the world is going, and we need more of this kind of insight. So on behalf of Not Another Crypto Show and Not Another podcast host, especially a white guy, thank you so much for being on the show. For all the listeners, thank you for taking the time to listen and make the moves, own the community, own your future, and find out what's happening. If you do nothing else, that's all I'm asking from you.
Making a high quality podcast like this one takes a lot of work. That's a fact. But not when you hire a podcast company. With our white glove experience, we handle everything for you. From guest outreach all the way through to publishing and promotion, we handle it all. You show up to hold great interviews and build relationships with your guests, and we take care of everything else. Podcasting is not just about the audience. Every podcast interview is the start of a new relationship. With a weekly podcast, you'd build relationships with 52 ideal partners or prospects through your podcast interviews over the next 12 months. Do you believe that 52 new relationships would help grow your business? We do. Contact Jason at apodcastcompany.com and let's talk.